We recently took a quick trip over the Danish border to collect a couple of new pieces to restore. The last few projects over the winter had ended up taking a lot of time and energy, and so I was really looking for a few smaller pieces of furniture that could be easy to transport, easy to restore, and a bit more affordable for the average buyer once it came time to put them back on the market again. One of the pieces we brought back with us was this oak chest of drawers. It was originally sitting on some skirting boards, but this was definitely a mid-century design. I would guess from the early 70s. The drawer pulls are often attributed to the Danish designer Birger Mogensen, but there was no manufacturer mark or anything like that, so really no way to be sure, especially with a design that was in every other way pretty generic. But it was cheap, and it was also oak, which was a nice change from all of the rosewood and teak that I normally work with. It originally came on some skirting boards, which I obviously removed, as I would be finding some nice legs for it later on to give it that classic mid-century modern look. The drawers were made of pine with presswood fronts under the veneer, but the overall construction was pretty solid, including some thick solid wood edge banding in areas which would normally just be veneered, which made it a little bit more durable than a lot of other similar pieces would be. In taking the drawers out, I noticed that the bottom two drawers were jamming pretty badly, which would suggest that this thing had been kept in a damp environment for a prolonged period of time. But that is pretty common with vintage furniture, and it's generally easy enough to repair. Getting started, I decided to just go straight for a scuff sand with the machine using 180 grit pads. The finish was so light and so worn that it really didn't need a chemical stripper, at least that's what I thought at the time. One of the benefits of oak is that it is an extremely hard and dense timber. The veneer is generally thicker, and so you've got a lot more room to play with before you run the risk of sanding out a flat patch or blowing through the veneer altogether. It all seemed to be going pretty well. There were very few scratches or defects, but there was definitely some discoloration on the top from UV exposure, where there had apparently been a set of shelves or something like that sitting on the top of it, which was pretty common for this style of furniture. Once the sanding was finished, I mixed up a batch of oxalic acid and applied it pretty sparingly, as it really didn't need anything too heavy. I also had to be pretty careful around the edges on the bottom as well, as there was some minor veneer damage that needed patching up, so it was important not to let any moisture get in there. As usual, for damage like this, I just use basic wood filler that comes in a tube, which can then be sanded and stained and touched up with markers later on. This is really all you need for minor damage in a place like this, where it's pretty unlikely to get noticed. Once everything was dry again, I wiped it all down to clean off all the little crystals. At this stage, I was able to determine pretty well that after a bit more sanding, the tan lines would be blended out and eliminated pretty much completely. I'd previously noticed that there were a couple of scratches on the top which had not been removed by the sander, so I used the soldering iron and a damp cloth to steam them back out again. I would have liked to have used the regular iron for this to really lift up the wood grain across all of the surfaces, but there were just too many areas where the moisture could have gotten under the veneer, especially in the seams, and it was just too risky. Fortunately, the oak veneer was so thick with such large fibers that I could still do quite a bit of sanding without losing any of the texture. My attempts to steam out the scratches had not been 100% successful, and so I had to do a lot more sanding, first by hand and then with the machine again, before I was finally able to get rid of them. Next on the list was to go around the repaired patches and sand them flat, ready for staining. Once again, this is nothing too fancy, but perfectly adequate for a repair like this. It's just a case of sanding very softly to create a smooth surface which can then be painted over with markers. I then moved on to the drawers, and again, although the sanding sponge was necessary to do the little edges and curves, I ended up having to use the machine again to really get the wood grain on the drawer fronts looking nice and even. After that though, I was pretty confident that I could now move on and apply the wood stain. I used my regular oil-based wood stain, this time in the colour oak, thinned down to a 1:1 ratio with mineral spirits, although it immediately became obvious that it was not soaking in evenly. I ended up using a piece of steel wool to really try and force the stain into the pores, but it was not having an impact. Aside from not taking evenly to the surface, I also noticed that it wasn't really having much of an impact on the colour of the timber, and so what I decided to do was to just skip the stain on the drawers and just apply blonde shellac onto the raw wood to see how it would look and to see if it would take evenly. Well, I have let everything dry off overnight here, and there's really almost no visual difference between the components or the pieces that were simply shellacked without any stain and the parts that were stained. The stain is blotchy and uneven, and the color tone is really the same as the shellacked parts, which are also blotchy and uneven. So what I'm going to do is just to continue applying shellac, and then once I've got a bit of a base coat in place and it's all sealed, I will add a bit of stain as a glaze on top of it to even it out, and we will see how that works. I continued building up a base coat of shellac on the drawers, hoping that I'd be able to resolve the problem basically by just continuing to apply more finish. It had been a long time since I'd worked with oak, but I do remember that it can be problematic sometimes. After doing some research, I found out that it was most likely one of two things. Either the patches were overstressed wood fibers which had become too dense to absorb anything, or it was simply residual oil in the wood grain which needed to be pulled out somehow. The consensus seemed to be that glazing with stain or tinted finishing products was probably the best way to resolve these issues, and so I pressed on, hoping that everything would eventually start blending out. I first tried just glazing over everything with a concentrated mix of the oak wood stain, but despite laying it on thick and then leaving it to dry overnight, I returned the next day to find out that it really hadn't done much at all. I even tried mixing the wood stain with some tung oil varnish and then adding a very thick coat of that on top, but it still didn't make any real difference. It was at this point that I realized I would have to do the thing I'd been trying so hard to avoid, which was to use chemical stripper and strip the whole thing back down to the raw wood again. The upside of this was that the stripper would penetrate into the wood and pull out the oil that was most likely causing the problem, so although I was annoyed with having to start from scratch again, I was confident that this would solve the problem once and for all. By the time I had stripped and cleaned the top, it was already looking a lot better, although I was not going to take any chances this time, and so I gave everything a good scrubbing with some mineral spirits before moving on to another round of light sanding with the machine. Fortunately, all the scratches and details had been taken care of, so this was really just to clean up the very top layer, ready for finishing again. This time I skipped the stain altogether and just started with the blonde shellac, which was really a perfect match for the natural colour and chatoyance of the oak, and gave it a much nicer finish than the stain timber did. There were always pros and cons with everything, and one of the cons with wood stain is that it can mute the natural contrast of the wood grain, so that it's not quite as vibrant or dynamic as it could have been. Sometimes that's what you want, but in this case, I think the natural tones of the oak veneer look better without it. After applying 4 coats of blonde shellac, I gave everything a quick sand and followed it up with 2 coats of wipe-on poly. I'm normally not such a big fan of polyurethane or lacquer, but in this case I needed a light and natural looking top coat to just add that little bit of extra durability without creating a cold or plastic appearance. In the interim, I had already prepared a set of legs to replace the old skirting. I had been having trouble getting the colours to match, as neither the stain nor the shellac were really soaking in. The legs were made from beech, which is just as hard as oak, and so it is also notoriously difficult to stain. I ended up getting the colour of the legs to match using brie wax, but unfortunately the footage of me installing the legs and doing all the final touches was accidentally deleted. So, for the record, I sanded the drawers and got them sliding smoothly again, and then polished everything with brie wax. Although this one was not the quick and easy furniture flip that I really wanted it to be, the final result was pretty good. Thanks for watching.